courage until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So yeah, I'll start by saying something that's silly, but last night I was, like I've been reading in my notes from the previous teaching by Khensa Rinpoche and various texts about the Dhammacavatara, and then to do this sort of what's called review or orientation, and then last night I thought, am I completely insane? Like, what? This is like impossible. But the reason being, like the Dhammacavatara, of course, is humongous, difficult text, right? And I think where I was like ideally one would do like a complete review of the tenet systems, of all the four tenet systems of Buddhism, and then a review of overall thinking of Madhyamaka, and then the Prasangika view of Madhyamaka as compared to the Svatantrika view of Madhyamaka. And so I was like looking at all that, and I was like, okay, that would take like 7 years. I was like, okay, so I won't worry about that. Then we can just do a general orientation and review, and that's more realistic. So I had to remind myself of what the goal was. It just made me laugh. And also, actually, I was looking in Khensa Rinpoche's biography. It doesn't say the number of years, but so at like Khensa Rinpoche's own, actually, first of all four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism or traditions study the Madhyamaka Avatara, and the Gelugpa tradition in particular. It's one of the 5 main texts that one studies to become a geshe. So Khensa Rinpoche, that was one of in his studies. So if you imagine, like Khensa Rinpoche's own study of this text took a few years, with like hours and hours and hours of debate, right, out on the debate courtyards with other monks studying specifically this text, right? And so I mean he's a great master of this text, obviously, and and then chooses how to chooses to teach. Obviously, if you think like in 10 days he taught the first 5 chapters last year. He obviously didn't teach as much detail as he had studied, but did teach quite a lot of detail. So anyway, actually where I thought to start is where Khensa Rinpoche often starts, which is, I think what Rinpoche's, I think that Rinpoche is kind of, well, first of all, I think he would teach this to anybody, but also is acknowledging is that, studying the middle way philosophy of Arya Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti is not an easy topic, right? If it were an easy topic, we would all already be enlightened, because this is the main topic, that one has to study to realize Buddhahood, right? This and conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta, right, which are both embodied in the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. So one thing that Rinpoche often and repeatedly teaches is the benefits of studying emptiness. And Rinpoche almost always begins with that when teaching about emptiness. And so I thought I would just share a few quotes that Rinpoche often quotes. One is from the sutra bestowed by to Kumara Ratnadatta. In that, the Buddha said, Manjushri, if someone listens to this teaching, even with doubt, that one accumulates more merit than bodhisattvas practicing the 6th perfection for hundreds of thousands of eons without skillful means. What need is there to mention if someone listens without doubt? So actually, I mean, right, just that phrase, right? More merit than a bodhisattva. So a bodhisattva, right? A bodhisattva is a person, right, who has bodhicitta, right? So that person practicing other virtues, right, without wisdom, for what does he say? Hundreds of thousands of eons. The benefits of studying the perfection of wisdom, particularly emptiness, is greater. Then Rinpoche quotes the Sutra of the Tathagata's Treasury, in which the Buddha said, even someone who has committed the 10 negative actions and then enters in, even if someone has committed the 10 non-virtuous actions, if they then intensively enter into these teachings on selflessness and have conviction and faith in the primordial purity of all phenomena, that sentient being will not go to the lower realms. Then he quotes the Sutra of Ajata Shastru, where the Buddha says, if someone who has committed the 5 uninterrupted negative actions later hears, enter into, and generates faith in this Dharma, meaning emptiness teaching, then I do not call that person's karma a karmic obscuration. And then Rinpoche often quotes Aryadeva, who famously said, quote, from his 400 stanzas. And Aryadeva was a student of Nagarjuna, right, and became and came before Chandrakirti. So this is a quote from his, this is one stanza from his 400 stanzas. Those of little merit have no doubts about this dharma, meaning emptiness. Even by merely generating doubt, samsara is torn to tatters. And one point that Rinpoche often mentions then is that that's the key, isn't it? In other words, through even doubt about emptiness, samsara is torn to tatters. And what Rinpoche is saying there is, you know, the foundation of samsara, right, the very foundation and the main cause of samsara is ignorance. And ignorance can only be eliminated by the wisdom realizing emptiness. And according to, actually I was thinking about this, like, so next year is I think it's the 500th anniversary of Lama Tsongkhapa's passing to Nirvana. And Lama Tsongkhapa, who wrote the famous commentary that Rinpoche used last year to this text, you know, so Lama Tsongkhapa emphasizes this point, right, and the Prasangika perspective. Right? So it's from the Prasangika perspective, it's only by understanding emptiness as it's taught by Chandrakirti that a person can become free from samsara. And actually, maybe I'll share that. The reason I request, actually, I always wanted to request against Rinpoche to teach this teaching. Part of the reason I requested was many years ago, Kirti Senchep Rinpoche, who was one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachers. He was teaching, I think, the 3 principles aspects of the path, and he got to the section on emptiness, and he was teaching what Lama Tsongkhapa taught in that very brief text. And it's beautiful, what Lama Tsongkhapa, but it's very brief, right? And then he said something like, but you won't, he was explaining it, and he said, this is, you know, Lama Tsongkhapa said this and that, and he was teaching about it. And then he said something, I can't remember the exact words, but basically he said something like, but you won't, you know, to all of us, he was saying, but you won't be able to realize this until you study Chandrakirti's Majjhamaka Avatar. He said, like, without studying that, well, you can't really understand it. And that's why all the traditions study it. That's why, you know, and so the point being, it's, you know, it's only by studying these teachings, right, that one begins the process of undermining the cause of samsara, which is ignorance, right, grasping an inherently existent self. And as one begins to doubt, right, and actually what that phrase doubt, right, is part of the process. Actually, I'll just mention that. It's part of the process of how do you realize emptiness, actually, right? And the idea is this, is at first, we grasp at a self with absolutely no doubt. In other words, like, we're willing to kill people over how strongly we grasp at ourselves. And so actually, you know, doubting that the truly existent self exists is the first step in a process of undermining that. Right? And if you study, what's it called, pramana, right? The Buddhist teachings on pramana, like so from the Pramana Vartika and so on, they talk about the 7 ways of knowing, and so there's a whole process they describe where you begin with, they actually say you begin with just a wrong view, right? Then there's doubt leading in the wrong direction, and then neutral doubt, and then and they say what some commentaries say what Arya Dev is referring to there is doubt leading in the correct direction. So it's doubt where you're starting to go, maybe myself doesn't exist. I'm kind of suspecting that. You know, this truly existent self I've been believing in. You start to go, maybe not. And he said, just that thought tears samsara. That's the so when you actually have that thought for yourself experientially, right? Wow, maybe this self that I feel so strongly when I'm angry, maybe it doesn't exist. He's saying just that doubt where you think maybe it doesn't really exist, and you experience that, he's saying that tears samsara. And then eventually you get like what's called correct assumption, where you, and that comes through studying with someone like Khensa Rinpoche, right? Where you hear Khensa Rinpoche teach over and over again on a topic like this, and there comes a point where you really start to go, not just doubt, but start to go, I really think this teaching's correct, that Chandrakirti's right, that the truly existent, inherently existent self doesn't exist. You don't yet fully understand that, but you get a kind of conviction. And that's part of the process. And then eventually from that, you go and you sit and you contemplate those teachings. Because actually that correct assumption comes through the power of study. But then when you contemplate deeply and reason on your own now, right, based on what you've studied through reading and through hearing someone like Khensa Rinpoche, then there comes a point where you gain, what do they call it, inferential cognition. That's a realization, actually, your own realization of emptiness. Right? You gain an inferential cognition of emptiness. And that's the first realization, actually. And then when you meditate on that, there comes a point where you'll gain the direct realization of emptiness, and then you become an Arya, and you enter the first Bodhisattva bhumi, and so on. Right? So that's actually the process of how you become free from samsara and become a Buddha. Right? And there's no way to do that without studying emptiness with someone like Chandrakirti. So anyway, that's in my like an advertisement for yeah, and Rinpoche, he gives other, I won't go through more, but I mean he gives a lot of different explanations of benefits. Oh, here's one more. In the Compendium of Sutras by Nagarjuna, he says, Nagarjuna says, just a little faith or belief in emptiness can collect all the merits and will bring all the mundane and supermundane qualities until you attain pure Buddhahood. Anyway, he gives many different quotes like that. One who has faith in the view of selflessness will not go to lower realms, even if they've done the 10 virtuous actions and so on. Okay, so that's just like a kind of beginning point, the benefits. Then we're going to do some review, right? So what did I say? The structure of Chandrakirti's text is structured according to the there are 10 chapters, right? And it's structured according to the 10 perfections. And jump back. Actually, maybe I'll start with this though. So, and when we say Majjhamaka Avatara, right? There are different ways that Western translators translate that title, but I think the translation that seems to be most accurate or most true to the commentary is supplement to the middle way. And Khenpo Rinpoche said this last time. He said, this is how he started. He said, middle way in that title, so Majjhamaka, refers in this case to Nagarjuna's text, the Mula Majjhamaka Karaka, I think it's called in Sanskrit. And so one way, so the way Khenpo Rinpoche said was that this text by Chandrakirti is a supplement to that text, right? So Chandrakirti recognized that there had been some time passed since Nagarjuna had composed his text on wisdom, and that people had misunderstood aspects of what Nagarjuna meant, so he wrote a supplement to kind of further clarify the meaning of what Nagarjuna was saying. And one thing, I guess, this Khenpo Rinpoche didn't explicitly mention this, but many times it's mentioned, so I'll just mention it. Like, it's interesting, right? Because if you look at the actual structure of Chandrakirti's text, there are sections on all 10 perfections. But if you look at the length of the chapters, the length of the chapter on the 6th, the one that we're going to study next month, right? The 6th chapter is about 2/3, I think, or so of the text. The vast majority of the text is on that one. Because what's the 6th perfection? The 6th perfection is perfection of wisdom. Right? And so you get the sense from that Chandrakirti had a strong interest in going into great detail about that 6th chapter. And if you start to look at what we're going to prepare to study in the 6th chapter, a lot of it is Chandrakirti addressing, one is he's explaining the meaning of emptiness, but he's also addressing things like the mind-only school's perspective and other philosophers' perspectives. Some of which had not yet been written, most of which had not yet been written at the time that Nagarjuna composed his text, right? So you can get the sense, well, why did Chandrakirti recognize there needed to be a supplement? One was, in general, right, there were many people who had sort of read Nagarjuna, and then afterwards they composed texts, or gave oral teachings, in which either they disagreed with Nagarjuna, or they thought they were agreeing with Nagarjuna, but were actually presenting a view that was not Nagarjuna's intent, right? And so you get this, I think, is part of why Chandrakirti felt the need to compose a supplement in which he had very directly, and without any hesitation addresses, you'll see if you read Chandrakirti's text, he's not shy, right? He's very direct. He's like, people say this, that's incorrect, and here's why. And then he gives about sometimes 5 or 6 different reasons why they're wrong. But so I have a question then, like, and yet it's interesting, right, that to contemplate for a moment. But Chandrakirti he could have just done chapter 6, right? He could have just written that. But he embeds that in a presentation of the 10 bhumis, right? And the 10 bhumis embody the 10 perfections, right? Also, right? They're each one, the bodhisattva becomes surpassing in one of the 10 perfections. And so many people have noted this, that first of all, that Chandrakirti did that, because that's obvious, right? It's the way he structures his entire text. And part of the point there, I think, one is, it's a wonderful topic, right, to study all the 10 perfections and the 10 bhumis. But another point I think that's worth noting is sometimes, actually, people who are not, people who are not practitioners of the Prasangika, so that's his school, right, his school of thought, that some say, different people, some people say Chandrakirti founded it, or others say Buddhapalita before him founded it. Doesn't matter, it's the same school, but people who are not followers of that school will almost without exception view that school as nihilistic. And so I think part of the reason that Chandrakirti embeds his discussion of the Prasangika view of emptiness within the context of practices like generosity, patience, and also the path system, right, of the 10 bhumis, is to implicitly and obviously assert this is not nihilism, right? This is a school that that also teaches a path and teaches conventional reality, right? Conventional truths, right? Because all those things, right? The bhumis, the paths, the other 9 perfections, are all conventional realities, right? So it's not a school that only teaches some kind of negation, right? It also teaches a positive set of practices. Yeah.
Does it also imply that the people who have not yet, the Arya beings, have not yet mastered those 10 perfections?
Yeah, actually, well, I guess yeah, in a sense it does, because what happens is, according to the Prasangika perspective, right? The text really, because if you look at the text starts with the praise of compassion, but then it gets the first chapter, full chapter, is on he calls it the first mind generation, right? Meaning the first bhumi and the first perfection of generosity. And so what he's saying, and what he actually says quite explicitly in his text, is that so one enters that first bhumi on first directly realizing emptiness. And in the Prasangika system, that means in the way it's explained by Chandrakirti. But then the bodhisattva, after they've directly realized emptiness and entered the first bhumi, the way they call it is that he or she, that bodhisattva, becomes surpassing in the perfection of generosity. And Khenpo Rinpoche said this last time. He said, such a bodhisattva practices all 10 perfections, actually. They do some degree of practice of all of those. But it's on the first bhumi that bodhisattva becomes capable of a surpassing or a remarkable degree or a kind of remarkable skill at the perfection of generosity. And the perfections are in order, or so of difficulty. So that bodhisattva cannot, while they certainly are very practice ethics, they're not yet capable of doing the surpassing level or this kind of remarkable level of ethics. And it's only at the second bhumi that the bodhisattva becomes capable, actually. So, I mean, of course, even before they reach the first bhumi, they were an ethical being. But Chandrakirti uses this thing where he says on the second bhumi, the bodhisattva becomes so surpassing in their ethics that even in their dreams, there isn't the slightest hint of an unethical thought, and so on. That they become so skilled, or so remarkable at ethics. But that person, on the second bhumi, while they're certainly a very patient person compared to us, is not yet surpassing in the practice of patience. And it's only on the third bhumi that the bodhisattva is capable of a sort of what for anybody else would be an unimaginable level of patience in a sense. So it is, yeah. So an Arya being, at the beginning of the first Bhumi, somebody's an Arya, but they're not yet capable of the surpassing level of the other perfections until as they go through each Bhumi, they become capable of this sort of remarkable level of practice of the corresponding perfection. So that's how that works, and it's their wisdom, and part of that's important, right? What's the main difference? Let's say it right. I mean, as they go along those different bhumis, I mean, they're accumulating more merit, but also they're let's say it right. You know, they've already realized emptiness directly, so the realization is not different, but the degree to which they can integrate that realization into their way of being in the world deepens, right? When they're out of, in other words, when that bodhisattva is in the state of this is a description, right? Well, the bodhisattvas actually are they go through two different, like there are two different, as they're going through the bhumis I'm talking about. A bodhisattva has two different ways of progressing, call it. One is when they're in a state of direct realization of emptiness. In that state, actually whether they're in the first bhumi or the 8th bhumi or something, there's actually no difference, right? Because the experience for that bodhisattva is of a complete absorption in a space-like appearance of emptiness, as they say. And another way they say it is, it's like water poured into water. They often use that metaphor. They say, so the mind and emptiness are like water. They're not, experientially, you can't differentiate them from a subjective perspective while in that state. But the other state that the bodhisattva has is when they come out of that samadhi, that concentration, and they're then going about their practices of generosity, of compassion for others, of service, of patience, of and so on, of all the other perfections and all their other activities. And so the bodhisattva goes through those two modes. Actually, and the bodhisattva progresses, though, from one bhumi to the next during a samadhi experience. Does that make sense? Like while meditating directly on emptiness. And when they come out of that meditation, they come out of it on the next level of the bodhisattva. Anyway, so they're progressing in their ability to practice the 6 perfections. You know, and even before somebody's realized emptiness directly and entered the first bhumi, so they're not yet an Arya, like a bodhisattva is already trying to practice 6 perfections, but someone at that level can't do it in the way that an Arya being can do it. And an Arya being on the bhumis, the higher the bhumi they are, the more skilled they are in practicing the perfections, the more capable they are. And no matter, that's an interesting point, right? Because no matter how much you would want to practice the perfections, that's part of the implication. Without that wisdom, understanding emptiness, your ability will be, you could aspire to do that, but your ability to actually do it is much weaker, and it becomes stronger the more wisdom, the more experience you gain of realizing, first contemplating, studying, contemplating, then meditating on emptiness, and then the higher your realization, or the higher your level of realization goes, the more you're able to practice the 6 perfections. And so, actually, I will mention that I think this is worth mentioning. So, actually, Chandrakirti also, just because I'll just mention this because it's quite. I was just going to read the first. The very first, right? So the very first verse, he says, "Hearers and Prajeka Buddhas, realizers of suchness, are born from the king of subduers." Right? So they're born from a Buddha. Then he says, "Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. The mind of compassion, non-dual understanding, and the altruistic mind of enlightenment are the causes of the children of conquerors." And then he says, "Mercy or compassion alone is seen as the seed of the conqueror's rich harvest. As the water for development, as the ripening in the state of long enjoyment, therefore at the start I praise compassion." So that's interesting. It's very unusual, isn't it? Like most Buddhist texts begin with a praise of the Buddhas or the Bodhisattvas or something like that. Actually, his does have an homage to Yusuf Manjushri, but that's actually not Chandrakirti. The Khenpo Rinpoche said that was the translator, added that, the Tibetan translator. So Chandrakirti begins his whole text on emptiness with a praise of compassion. And actually, what is he saying there? He's saying compassion is the root, right? Is the cause, is the seed. Actually, he's saying it's the seed, it's the water, and it's the ripening. It's not just even the seed, right? It's like, if you're going to grow a flower, right? You have to have a seed, you have to have water, you have to have soil. He's basically saying compassion's all of that. Like, compassion is the whole thing. Compassion, and he's saying compassion is what gives rise to the Buddhas, right? It's what gives rise to bodhisattvas, and the bodhisattvas become Buddhas, and then all the other beings, like, here, so the Travakas, Prajeka Buddhas, they all come from the Buddha's teaching. So he says, so all of that starts with compassion. Does that make sense? Just isn't that beautiful? Beautiful way to start the text. And it's implicit, right? So the reason, why is he going to teach all these teachings on emptiness? Out of compassion. Okay, so anyway, that's that. Then the first 5 chapters, which Rinpoche taught last time, go through the first 5 perfections. And I'm just going to summarize a little bit, because it doesn't make sense to go into great detail, because Rinpoche covered that, but to kind of orient us. One point Rinpoche made is that the first 3 perfections, right, so generosity, ethics, and patience. Rinpoche said, I think Rinpoche, actually when I asked Rinpoche to teach this text, he seemed enthusiastic about teaching the first 3 chapters. My impression was that after that he was like kind of, he didn't look as excited. But I was asking, so I don't know. He said he would teach the text. And part of the reason for that is he said in the teaching, the first 3 perfections, and Chandrakirti says this and the Buddha said this, the first 3 perfections are, while they are practiced by all bodhisattvas, are especially conducive, a lay life, in other words, a lay person's life is especially conducive to those. And why, right? Well, one is for generosity, right? Lay people have more stuff, right? So it's easier to give it away. With ethics, he made this point. If you're a hermit living somewhere, there's not much temptation, right? But if you're a layperson who's out in the world and having relationships and having business and having all kinds of things, then there's all kinds of temptations to lie or to cheat or to steal or to be dishonest or to, whatever, all those things, right? And then that's where you practice ethics, is when you're tempted not to practice ethics, right? And then patience, again, like there are, you're interacting with all kinds of people, and so there's more circumstances where people aren't doing what you brilliantly think they should be doing, and therefore you get annoyed with them, and then patience is learning not to get annoyed with them, right? And so he was saying, for lay people, those perfections are especially emphasized. It's not that monastics don't practice those, but they have less. They say that the last 3 perfections are more emphasized for monastic practitioners or hermits or people who are off, right? Like so, meditative, for example, like meditative concentration, right? That's difficult to be deeply in when you're very busy. And then wisdom. Again, we're trying to study, but actually, if you look at, like, we're trying to do this study, right? But it's like difficult to set up 5 days, right, of intensive study. So if you compare that to, say, in the monastery where they do that, it's like, they maybe have months and months and months of every day, that's all they're doing. So in terms of cultivating wisdom, it's more conducive. It's an easier thing to do if you're living that kind of lifestyle. So anyway, so Rinpoche made this point that the first 3 perfections are emphasized for lay people, and that's good for us to remember. And then he went through the benefits of those, right? And in brief, one point he made is that bodhisattvas don't engage in them selfishly, right? Bodhisattvas engage in the 6 perfections for the welfare of others, right? And then actually there's a beautiful explanation that Chandrakirti gives where he says, bodhisattvas, in terms of the perfection of giving, that like the level of joy they feel when they come across somebody who wants something is humongous, right? Like they so want to practice giving that when they come across somebody in need, they feel this like overwhelming experience of joy. So that, like, if I'm just thinking of that, what's that thing, like, if you're in New York City, for example, and then, like, somebody will come running over with, like, a squeegee and try to clean your front window of your car, right? Like, if you ever had that experience, like, because I remember one time, the first time that I was like, oh, what's this person do? Like, you know, or know the person, suddenly they're running over and without, you know, the bodhisattva would feel like incredible overwhelmed joy, right? Like, oh, great, somebody needs something. They want something from me, great. Like, that's their experience, right? Whereas they say that the bodhisattva comes across a beggar and they feel overwhelming joy. Like, oh, I've been looking for somebody like you. Somebody who's willing to explicitly say you want something, because then I can help you. And then, of course, the ultimate, if you practice them as a perfection, the ultimate result of that is Buddhahood. Right? In the short run, a result of generosity is having enough resources to continue working for others. So, you know, a karmic result of ethics is having good rebirths, right? So that you can continue to practice. So that's why you have to do those, right? If you don't have ethics, then you can't have good rebirths, and then you don't continue your path. You go astray. Another point I wanted to make in just reviewing those previous classes is in each of those first 5 perfections, Chandrakirti, and Rinpoche mentioned this, teaches what makes it a perfection, right? Like, in other words, if you give a present to somebody, is that the perfection of generosity? And the answer would be, it depends on your mind, right? Not necessarily, in other words. Not all generosity is the perfection of generosity. And Khenchen Rinpoche he mentioned a few things. One is, for something to be the perfection of generosity, one is it has to be motivated by bodhicitta, motivation, right? Conventional bodhicitta, the wish to achieve Buddhahood for the welfare of all sentient beings. A second point is, it should be done with awareness of the emptiness of the 3 spheres. And that's taught in each one of the first 5 chapters, this idea of the emptiness of the 3 spheres, right? So in that sense, the gift, the giver, and the recipient are empty, right? So it's a recognition, right? Actually, and what does that mean, right? Well, one is it means like, so you feel I'm a giver, right? I'm giving, right? But actually, being a giver is dependent upon a gift and a recipient, right? And being a recipient is dependent upon the gift and the giver. And being a gift, right, the object is not a gift from its own side, it's only a gift in a context of a giver and a recipient. And in what sense is it a gift then, right? It's not a gift from its own side, so it's only a gift merely labeled, right, by the mind, right? And in what sense is the giver a giver, right? Well, they're not a giver from their own side, like, right? They're only a giver in dependence upon this mere appearance of relationality, right? This sort of, that there's somebody who happens to be receiving and there happens to be an object given, right? Then you label, oh, they're the giver, right? So that's those things only exist dependently, you could say, or only exist in mere name. Right? They exist conceptually as a mere label, right? So they're empty of being truly existent from their own side, right? And so the giver, for example, in that case, gives the gift without awareness. That's also making it a perfection. And then they dedicate the merit to Buddhahood. So if a practice is done with those components, then it's a perfection. If they're not, then it's not. Does that make sense? And you know, in the Vajrakuta Sutra, it says that, right? It says if somebody, the Vajrakuta Sutra, right, which is one of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, has this section where it talks about this, and it basically says, I can't remember the exact wording, but it basically says, like, you know, if a bodhisattva gives a gift while grasping at themselves as a truly existent giver, he says, then I don't call them a bodhisattva. And he's saying, what he's getting at is this point, right? That the perfections are done with an awareness of the emptiness of the 3 spheres, right? And you notice the emptiness of 3 spheres, right, is teaching what? Dependent origination, which is the meaning of emptiness, right? Or emptiness is the meaning of dependent origination. Interdependent, right? Dependent origination. That those things exist in, what's the word? As mutually dependent, right? A gift can only exist in dependence upon giver and recipient, right? It's dependent, and so it doesn't exist from its own side.
So, Dr. Lauren, are we just referring to the second level of dependent origination, the mutual dependence, or does it have cause and effect as well as the third level, subjective mind?
In this case, in a gift, all 3 would actually apply, wouldn't it? All three levels. I mean, because I mentioned the merely labeled, that's the third level, right? It's conceptually labeled. There's also clearly the mutual dependence. But because, in the sense of generosity, it's a compounded phenomena, so it depends on causes and conditions as well. So you could say all three levels of dependence, right? Because, yeah, because in the case of giving, right, it's always a compounded phenomena that arose due to causes and conditions. So you could say all three levels of dependence arise and would apply.
Is the idea of recognizing the emptiness of the three spheres, is it, what is the point of that? Is it to let go of like ego, like I'm giving, and sort of the grasping of I'm giving this thing that matters to me?
Yes, in part, yes. But just to elaborate a little bit,
Yes,
um,
please.
one thing that that's often pointed out is this: why does that make it a perfection, right? Like it's clear, like the bodhicitta is part of making it a perfection, right? Because with bodhicitta, your motivation, right? Because the karma behind something is dependent upon the motivation, right? We've always said that, right? Like, you know, if you do something out of. So if the wish is to achieve Buddhahood for the welfare of all sentient beings, that's the motivation. And remember, with karma, it's the intention is the main factor in karma. Right? So if the intention is to become a Buddha, then the result, then that becomes the result. Otherwise, it doesn't become the result. So that's one. But then, in terms of this idea of the emptiness of the three spheres, one point it's made is this: so think about samsara, right? And actually, I'll go into this a little bit because Ken Rinpoche taught this when he was teaching last year on this topic. He was saying, for ordinary beings like us, every single positive, obviously every negative karma we do is ultimately underpinned by ignorance. Right? And out of ignorance, say we become angry, and then we act angrily and we create negative karma. But Ken Rinpoche was saying, for ordinary beings like us, also every virtuous thing we do is underpinned by ignorance, because everything we do is underpinned by ignorance, because our whole experience is tainted with self-grasping. And so in that sense, even when you're doing, let's say I go and make offerings on the altar, or something, and I'm doing it with some sense of faith and devotion, right? But I'm doing it grasping at a truly existent giver, gift, say water, right, and recipient, the Buddha. Like, and I have some feeling, I like the Buddha, and I'm making offerings to the Buddha, and I have faith in the Buddha. That's virtue, right? So it will lead to a positive result, because it's done out of faith, let's say. But because it's done with self-grasping, it's still a cause of samsara, actually. Right? Any action done with grasping at a truly existent self is compounding or continuing one's habit of self-grasping, which is the basis of samsara. And so in that sense, even our virtue is creating more samsara. Right? It may create, for example, a positive rebirth, but within samsara. And so one thing that they're saying is when you engage in virtue, though, with this awareness of the emptiness of the three spheres, going back to, remember that quote from Aryadeva, then you're tearing, what does he say? Tearing shreds, tearing samsara to shreds, right? So then you're undermining samsara, right? You're actually, that action is undermining the continuation of samsaric existence. And so that's why this idea of the emptiness of the three spheres becomes incredibly important when doing the practices of a bodhisattva. Otherwise, there's the danger, actually, isn't there, of those practices leading to positive rebirths, but not to liberation from samsara and not to Buddhahood, right? Because Buddhahood is a state beyond samsara, which means it has to be. It has to arise out of wisdom, not ignorance grasping a truly existent self. And so if the goal is actually to do actions that are going to, because what's the function of the six perfections is to become a Buddha, actually, right? And so for them to serve that function, they have to be, influenced by wisdom rather than self-grasping. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So that's why it becomes very important. And so all those, in each of the first five perfections, there's this idea that you bring the awareness of the emptiness of the three spheres, right, to your practice of those, right? So if it's ethics, then it would be, same thing, right? The ethical person, the training, and and so on. If you were, and patience, right? It would be, yourself and the person who you think is harming you, and the act of harm, and so on.
Yeah, so, but so bodhicitta has to precede that thought, or
Pursue which thought?
like your actions, like with the awareness of the three spheres. So the bodhicitta has to precede that. It's necessary, right? Or
Yeah, because otherwise, think about it. If a person were aware of the emptiness of the three spheres, but didn't have bodhicitta, right? Like, so for example, take ethics as the example, right? Like Hinayana Arhats, like someone who's going to become a Hinayana Arhat practices the higher training in ethics. And at a certain point, they're aware of the emptiness of the three spheres, right? Because they realize emptiness, right? Say like a stream enter. There's I'll give an example. A stream enter who's realized emptiness is on the way to becoming a Hinayana Arhat. That person has realized emptiness already, according to the Prasangika perspective. And then they're practicing, they're being ethical, right? So but they'd be aware of the emptiness of the three spheres, but they don't have bodhicitta. And so the result of their ethical training will be their own personal liberation, but not Buddhahood, because they don't have that level of compassion, and so and that level of commitment to the welfare of others. So it's bodhicitta that makes it a Mahayana practice and makes it the result become Buddhahood, rather than if you just had emptiness of the three spheres awareness but no bodhicitta motivation, then your practice of the perfections would just lead to a personal liberation, but not to Buddhahood, where you're then capable of benefiting all sentient beings. So it wouldn't be a perfection in the sense that it wouldn't be leading to Buddhahood. It would lead to your own personal well-being in future lives, or eventually to your own liberation from samsara, but not to Buddhahood, because Buddhahood depends. Right, that's why Chandrakirti begins. He says the Buddhas come from compassion. Right? He says compassion is actually the cause of a Buddha. Right? And so if the person doesn't have bodhicitta motivation in the sense of that level of compassion, then even if they do virtuous actions, and even if they do them with the emptiness of three spheres, that will lead to their own liberation, but won't lead to Buddhahood, because they don't have that cause. And so you need both causes, actually, right? For an action to become a cause of Buddhahood, you can see that, right? You need the cause of bodhicitta, compassion, right, as the motivating factor, and then you need the awareness of the emptiness of three spheres, so that it's under the influence of wisdom rather than ignorance.
is that just what you just said? Is that synonymous with when you read is dependent on the two bodhicittas? Is that kind of like the same thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and people know that, right? So it's like there's two bodhicittas, right? One is conventional bodhicitta, is the wish to achieve Buddhahood for the welfare of others, for all beings. And then ultimate bodhicitta is the realization of emptiness, right? Especially for by a bodhisattva. To be called, actually, Ken Rinpoche said this in the first last year. He said, for something to be called ultimate bodhicitta, it has to be a realization of emptiness, but it has to be in the mind stream of a bodhisattva, of somebody who with bodhicitta. Otherwise, it's not ultimate bodhicitta. Does that make sense? So the ultimate bodhicitta is the direct realization of emptiness in the mind stream of somebody who has bodhicitta motivation. I'm going to jump. I'm just trying to decide if there's anything else. And Rinpoche made, I'm just sort of pausing because Rinpoche made many different sort of, what's the word, like detailed points as he explained the first 5 chapters. But I'm not sure. I think what might be most useful, though, so I could go more into detail about those, but I think what might be most useful to people is now to focus just a little bit on like an orientation to the 6th chapter. Because there's something I was thinking about related to that. So maybe I'll at least start with that, and if we have time, we'll go back and say more about the first 5 chapters. So like I said, the 6th chapter is by far the longest chapter, like, by far the longest chapter. And what was occurring to me, and this is why I was like last night, like worrying or something, is in the 6th chapter is unbelievably profound, actually. I mean, like, that was why I think, like I said, many years ago when Kirti Central Rashid was saying, like, this is the, like, if you want to realize emptiness, this is the text to study, and he's not unique in that, right? Like, when they set up the, actually, like, first of all, Lama Tsongkhapa, right, he wrote this text called The Illumination of Thought, right, which is a humongous, beautiful commentary to this text, and then, actually, Khenpo Rinpoche last year was using that as the basis of his teaching. So he was teaching Chandrakirti's text, but he was using Jason Kappa's commentary to explain it. I was talking to Tashi the other day, and he said, I should say this. Okay, so Tashi said a couple things. One is he said, if people want to really understand what Rinpoche is talking about, I suggest they read chapter 6 of Lama Tsongkhapa's text before. You don't have to do that; it's not a requirement. But he said, this is, he's basically saying this is difficult material. And if you've read Lama Tsongkhapa's explanation of chapter 6, even if you don't understand all that Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, it'll orient you well so that when Rinpoche is teaching, you'll get it. But then he said also that Khenpo Rinpoche had said he was looking at it and he decided he's not going to use, mainly not going to use Lama Tsongkhapa's text itself this time, because he said, the way Tashi said is, because that'll take forever. And so
348 pages.
yeah, exactly. It's very extensive. So, so I guess Khenpo Rinpoche's, Khenpo Rinpoche's home monastery is Saramay, and the Lama who wrote the textbooks for Saramay is named Kedrup Tempa Darge, and he wrote a commentary to Madhyamaka Avatara that's based on Lama Tsongkhapa's text, but is much briefer, as a sort of study textbook kind of thing that they use at Saramay. Khenpo Rinpoche, when he was studying, he studied that and another text by Kedrup Tempa Darge and Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary and other commentaries. But he decided to use that. He said he's going to mostly use Kedrup Tempa Darge's text, mainly because it's briefer. It's a briefer presentation that covers the key points that Lama Tsongkhapa. But what happens is Lama Tsongkhapa, if you read his text, you'll see he goes into very kind of like, what's the word, deep, extensive, sort of, like Chandrakirti will make a certain point, and then Lama Tsongkhapa will say, well, that point implies, and then, it's like pages and pages and pages and pages of sort of discussion philosophically of what the implications of that are and why it's correct and so on. Whereas I actually, Kedrup Tempa Darge's text doesn't exist in English, but I think he kind of leaves out some of those sort of side points or more extensive philosophical discussions. So Rinpoche will use that. But Tashi said if you've read chapter 6 of Lama Tsongkhapa's text, it will really help you. So one point I'll make is I tried to send that around to people, but if you didn't get that, we have it as a PDF. And if you didn't get that and you want it, at the end, write down your email address and give it to me, and I'll email it to you if you want. If you actually want to read it before Khenpo Rinpoche comes, and you're going to be attending his classes and you just would like to do that, then I'll email it to you if you like. But what I was thinking is this. So that'd be a great, orientation. But I just thought to say a few things about chapter 6 by way of orientation. And maybe I'll start with the simplest way. Like, in the Gelugpa tradition, they're considered to be, they're actually, they list many, 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 we call them like lines of reasoning, right, for meditation on emptiness, from a practice perspective, right? If you're going to sit down and meditate on emptiness, because actually the process of meditating on emptiness is you identify the object to be negated, right? And that sounds philosophical, but actually the object to be negated is your own experience of yourself and other things. It's a philosophical term, right? But it actually is referring to something very experiential. And actually, Khenpo Rinpoche once told a story. He said, Khenpo Rinpoche said that when he was young in Tibet, and Chujeng Rinpoche, who was one of the tutors to the Dalai Lama, was teaching about meditation and emptiness. He said, Khenpo Rinpoche said he had this experience. They went up like on it's Tibet, right? So they went on a cliff, and then like the person who was going to meditate on emptiness would stand near the edge of the cliff, You know, and if you've ever stood, like, you've all probably had that experience, right, where you stand near the edge of like a high precipice, right? And there's something that happens in your body, right, isn't there, when if you start to look down. I remember once I was doing that, I was looking down, it was when I was in college, I was like, we had hiked, and we were at a very high point. And I didn't know there was like a police academy nearby where they were practicing a shooting range. So I was leaning over and suddenly, like, all these rifles went off, and I must have like leapt back. But Rinpoche was doing that, so they would have, Chujang Rinpoche would have the people experience like that, so they would stand, look over, and then somebody else, they would grab onto the person, so they wouldn't fall, and then somebody would push them, like as if they were going to fall. And that feeling would arise, and then they would sit down and meditate, right? Because that's the object to be negated. It's that sense of I in your chest, right? So you can imagine that. Like, that's how visceral. So my point is, this is a philosophical point, but it's not just a philosophical point. That was how they actually did it, right? Sometimes they'll say, oh, imagine, in the text they'll say, like, imagine somebody insulted you or accused you wrongly of something, or think of when you were angry and your sense of self. But this was a technique Chujang Rinpoche used, was like, you know, getting pushed off a cliff, you know, the I arises very strongly. That's the object. So it's like the object to be refuted is the truly existent I, right? Or the I that exists inherently from its own side. So you identify that I experientially in your own, in the moment in yourself. Does that make sense? You can't just, it can't just be some intellectual exercise. It has to be an actual experience. And then you recognize, and then you're going to analyze, does that I exist or does it not exist? Right? And then you have to use reasoning. This is where the Dalai Lama says, right, is reason, right? So you use reasoning to prove that either it exists or it doesn't exist. And you have to have like an analytical framework that's precise and definitive in which to analyze that. And then you come to a conclusion. Either it exists or it doesn't. And if you realize it doesn't exist, that's emptiness. Right? The recognition that, that's the meaning of emptiness, right? That the object to be negated doesn't exist, so it's empty. That's what's, let's see. So the I is, when we say the I is empty or selflessness, that's what we mean, right? That in that sense, that I. And what I was going to note is one thing, which is if you look in like practice manuals and the Lam Rim and so on, the main methods for meditating, the main like reasonings for meditating in emptiness come from this chapter, actually. And I don't know how much to go into detail about those, so maybe I'll make that. So I'll make that point first. So their main reasonings that you actually use experientially to meditate on emptiness come from this chapter of Chandrakirti. And then another thing that Chandrakirti does in this chapter is because we already said he's supplementing Nagarjuna's text, so he also addresses many points from other philosophical schools, for example, and particularly there's a couple of long sections, where he's refuting, actually all other Buddhist schools, including, and particularly the mind-only school, because that was written, Asanga and Vasubandhu and other authors in the mind-only school came after Nagarjuna. So Nagarjuna's texts don't extensively address the philosophical views of the mind-only school, so Chandrakirti does. And so one thing I was thinking is, oh wow, if people don't know a little bit about the mind-only school, then it's going to be hard to, when Khenpo Rinpoche gets to the section where he's saying, and then Chandrakirti is saying this about the mind-only school, if you don't know a little bit about what the mind-only school's assertions are, then it's going to be hard to understand what Chandrakirti is saying. So I thought, okay, it's important to maybe at least briefly mention that. And I'll make one other point. And then Chandrakirti kind of asserts in this chapter what later, he didn't call, he wouldn't use this term, but later thinkers call, like, sometimes they make a list now. There are different lengths of lists. Often it's 8. Sometimes they'll say 8 difficult points of the Prasangika school. So he raises some very kind of subtle philosophical points that are very unique, and they're also in that chapter.
Dr. Aaron, two set of questions here. So, is Madhyamika taught before Pramanavartika or after Pramanavartika? Because they ask because if you look at Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary, you see a lot of overlap on Pramana side of stuff when he's saying, cause for a dream or a cause for latencies to come forth and so on and so forth.
I have to check when I don't remember when the Pramanavartika was written, to be honest, so I have to look that up.
What was the question?
Was this text written before or after the Pramanavartika? I was saying, I don't remember when the Pramanavartika was actually written, so I'm not sure.
The second set of question I had was maybe post Nagarjuna's period, when Vasubandhu and Asanga, the Chitramatra school and all that came into being. Probably it looks like a refutation for a lot of that from Chandrakirti's perspective, besides expounding on what Nagarjuna meant, which was very complex to start with. That'd be a first.
Yeah, if you look at, actually, I mean, this has been written about extensively. One is, the dates of the Pramanavartika I'd have to look up, it won't be quick, so I'll have to look it up some other time, but this other point, yes, so actually, if you really look carefully, what happened was, after Nagarjuna's time, actually, even as I'm saying after, I should preface this, even when I say after Nagarjuna's time, of course, even that's a little controversial in a sense, because, of course, Western scholars don't always agree with this, although Bob Thurman does, but, all the Buddhist tradition asserts that Nagarjuna lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So, even saying after Nagarjuna, actually, Kensho Rinpoche said Chandrakirti was a student of Nagarjuna. And I was like, well, does that mean, a student of his tradition, or, they say Nagarjuna lived for hundreds of years.
600 years.
Yeah, something over 500, whatever. So, so what is it? I don't even sure what does it mean after Nagarjuna's time in that sense. But in general, they say that there were a couple different issues. One is, there were a lot of texts written by, mind-only scholars, and the foremost of whom were Asanga and. Oh, actually, no, that answers it, because if you think of who they were, they include Dharmakirti. It was Asanga, Vasubandhu, and Dharmakirti. So he would have written before that. Yeah, that answers that. So they were writing mind-only scriptures, sort of, which are very respected, but are not in agreement with the position of Nagarjuna. And then there were other scholars like. So actually, after Aryadeva's time, Buddhapalita wrote a commentary to Nagarjuna's text, which Gelugpa scholars would say takes the same perspective as Chandrakirti, although it was earlier. And then other scholars like Baba Viveka then wrote now he's considered like the founder of the Svatantrika Madhyamaka school. Where he disagreed, he felt that he was explaining, of course Baba Viveka was a great scholar, and he felt he was correctly explaining the meaning of Nagarjuna's text, and he disagreed with Buddhapalita. So he presented a kind of a Madhyamaka perspective, but that was not the same as Buddhapalita's. And then Chandrakirti was also disagreeing with him. In other words, in part, Chandrakirti's position was arguing not only that mind-only school, while useful, was not ultimately correct, but also that Baba Viveka's perspective was not ultimately correct, and that his critique of, at one point Baba Viveka critiques Buddhapalita's writings, and Chandrakirti says he's wrong, essentially, and why, and he kind of makes a much more explicit explanation of why Buddhapalita was correct and Baba Viveka was wrong. So he addressed all those philosophical concerns in his text. So he was refuting kind of all those different kind of perspectives that came up after the writing of Madhyamaka's middle way, of Nagarjuna's middle way texts.
But without the understanding of Pramana side of stuff, it's pretty difficult to understand the 6th chapter, at least from Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and Lama Tsongkhapa paid that was one of Lama Tsongkhapa's many contributions, was this bringing together of those different traditions, bringing together of some of the approaches of Pramana. What's interesting though is that if you look at it, like Dharmakirti's philosophical position was not as advanced as Chandrakirti's, but what Lama Tsongkhapa does is he takes the elements of Dharmakirti's thought and philosophy and techniques of reasoning that are useful, but then applies them in support of Chandrakirti's position, rather than Dharmakirti's philosophical position about emptiness. So it's a very subtle approach that Lama Tsongkhapa does. That was a great contribution, but yeah, so that's kind of.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, maybe I'll just briefly do two things. One is to mention a few of the lines. Well, I'm trying to decide which order to do them. Maybe first I'll mention two or three lines of reasoning from Chandrakirti because they come up in the chapter. And then I'll want to say a few things about the mind-only schools so that you're oriented to that, in case people aren't as familiar. But the lines of reasoning, one, which is usually called, and Chandrakirti does a good deal of this, it's called, in the chapter, and it's called they usually call it the diamond slivers, like, so that's often the translation, the diamond slivers, like, like slivers, slivers like chips or something, like little pieces. Diamond fragments, almost you could say, right? A line of reasoning. And that line of reasoning is usually applied to phenomena, not to the self, but to, so the mind, it's like to mind or to objects. You actually could apply it to a person, but also it's used most often in the literature, they apply this to phenomena, like mind or a cup or a table or something. Or actually, the most commonly used example, so maybe we'll use that, is a seed and a plant, like a sprout. And actually, this is important because you'll see, I mean, actually, Chandrakirti already mentioned it last time. There's a phrase in Madhyamaka thinking called unproduced. Right? So you say, all things are unproduced. And that could be confusing, couldn't it? Because like we say, well, everything's dependently arisen, so it's all produced, right? Like things are produced by causes and conditions. So how do you say things are produced by causes and conditions and they're unproduced? Right? It could seem confusing at first, or seem. But what they're getting at there is this: is what that's getting at is things are not inherently produced. That's the meaning, actually. When they say unproduced, it means things are not inherently produced. And so what Chandrakirti actually says is, from a conventional perspective, right? We'd say, for example, a plant, right? A sprout comes from a seed. Right? Or you could say like, and actually we say that with anything, right? Because all kinds of things arise in dependence upon cause and conditions. So we say, we'll say, the workers brought the materials and built my house, right? Or my car was made at the plant, we talk about it that way, right? So we recognize things come from causes and conditions. And Chandrakirti makes actually this is going to be important. So Chandrakirti makes some points. He says, and that's true. That's conventional truth, right? And he makes a point. Actually, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he basically says, don't analyze conventional truth too much. He's making a point. He's saying conventional truth is just can be discussed on a conventional level, but if you start to analyze it, he's making a point. I guess one way of putting it is this, from a philosophical point of view. Conventional truth is a matter of conventional discourse. Does that make sense? Like, so if I say, I plant, if a farmer would say, or actually if somebody in their backyard said, I planted tomatoes and, so we say, I planted tomatoes and they came in, right? Now, like, if you were to say, well, you planted tomatoes, you plant tomato seeds, and, so on, that's the wrong level of discourse, right? Whereas conventional discourse merely exists, conventionally. And so you can't subject it to ultimate analysis unless you're subjecting it to ultimate analysis, in which case what you discover is emptiness, right? So that's an interesting example, isn't it? I planted tomatoes. Yeah, they just came in. Okay. That's not ultimately true, is it? Right? You can plant tomatoes. But, and so here in this ultimate analysis, now diamond slivers is an ultimate analysis of production, which means that ultimately things are unproduced. That's what the meaning is there. Conventionally, of course, they're produced by causes and conditions, and that's the conventional discourse. But in this particular reason, what they say is, if things were intrinsically produced, were truly produced, they would have to be produced from, and this is the 4 points, from self, from other, from both, or from neither. Right? And so, and this is, I'm just going to go through it briefly. This would be a topic, this would be a huge topic, right? But so you'd say, okay, what's it called? Sprout. If a sprout were produced from itself, right, actually Chandrakirti says, well, then it already existed. So that is a meaningless statement, right? So to say things are produced from themselves, he says, then that's no production at all because they already existed. So it's clear that a thing cannot be produced from itself. At one point he says it has no meaning, Another point is, then it already existed. Another is, if it produced from itself, then it would just continue to produce itself and it would exist eternally and wouldn't be impermanent, which is not our, which contradicts our own experience. So clearly things are not produced from themselves. And then he says, so then are things produced from, are things truly produced, or inherently produced from other, from something that's inherently other? And then he says, well, if things were produced from things that were inherently, like, there's an important distinction here, right? Inherently other, right? Like truly other. Does that make sense? He's saying, well then, first of all, anything would produce anything, right? Then I could plant, what's it called, like a seed of poison, and it should give rise to tomatoes. Or I should plant barley seeds in order to have corn, right? Because those are inherently other, right? Those are other, right? And the point is that, like say a barley seed and a barley plant aren't inherently other. They're not the same, right? It's not produced from self, but they're also not inherently other. They're, what's the word? They're relational, right? And another way of saying that is this, is like, actually you can say it this way, because what's their relation? I'm going off on a tangent here for a second. Their relationship is cause and effect, right? Like a barley seed can be is a cause to an effect. But in what sense are they cause and effect, right? The barley, like, in other words, the barley seed is only a cause of a barley sprout in dependence upon the sprout, right? If the sprout never comes, then it wasn't the cause of that, right? So it's their relation, it only exists as a cause relationally to the result. And the result only exists as a result of that relationally to the cause. They're not intrinsically those things, right, from their own side. So so things cannot arise. If things arose from something that was inherently other, then things would, anything, he says, anything would arise from anything. There wouldn't be that interdependent relationality. Then he says, could they arise from both? He says, well, then you would have the faults of both, that it would already exist, and anything would arise from anything, and that's completely senseless. And then he says, and could they arise from neither? And he says, well, there is no other option other than that things arise causelessly, but our own perception clearly. There is then, he makes one, he says, then farmers wouldn't grow crops, and then if you wanted a new car, you wouldn't go to the car dealership, you would just sort of like reach up in the sky and pull out your new car. It's not contradicts experience directly, right? Contradicts our own direct experience.
Like cause and effect.
Of causality. And so then he says, so now you get the idea of conventional, I'm just pointing this point of conventional truth. You could say, you know, oh, I planted tomatoes and I got, you know, now they're in and we're gonna have them for dinner. And conventionally that's a valid statement, right? From ultimate analysis, those tomatoes did not arise from themselves. They didn't arise from an other. They didn't arise from both, and they didn't arise from neither. They're unproduced, ultimately. Right? In other words, ultimately, and actually you could say, ultimately, yeah, ultimately they're unproduced, or ultimately they never arose from the perspective of ultimate analysis. Meaning they're empty of intrinsic existence. So conventionally, you get the idea of, now you're starting to get hopefully the idea of the middle way school and conventionally things exist. How? Actually, you could say, one way of saying it is as dependent arisings, right? But ultimately they're unarisen. Or things are produced due to causes and conditions, or due to dependent factors. Ultimately they're unproduced. That's one line of reasoning. Since Ken Shermish is going to go into much more detail, I won't try to go into more about that. But I want to also, I'll use this thing for this. There's another, he presents many lines of reasoning in his text. But one more.
Dr. Does he go further to say that because of emptiness, the production is possible too? Or does it not?
Nagarjuna says that, yeah. Yeah, Nagarjuna says because of emptiness all things are possible. And he's actually, and Nagarjuna says, and if things were not empty, they couldn't arise. And because of emptiness, things are not ultimately arisen, and without emptiness, things could not arise. It's interesting.
So what of the nihilistic part? That's very essential as well.
Yeah, so it's not, I mean, you can see how he's not nihilistic, right? Yeah. He's not denying conventional existence, although conventional, and this is a subtle point also, although from Chandrakirti's perspective, conventional existence is a kind of existence, right? And it's deceptive by its very nature. And the reason why it's deceptive, from Chandrakirti's perspective, is that things seem to exist, everything, all conventionally existent phenomena, to an ordinary person, all conventionally existent phenomena seem to exist in their own right, or from their own side. Right? The tomato seems to be arisen, it seems to exist from its own side. And that's deceptive. I, to myself, seem to exist from my own side, truly, right, or intrinsically. And that's deception. So conventionally existent phenomena, it's very subtle, isn't it? He's not saying they don't exist. They do exist, right? But they're deceptive in that they seem to exist in their own right or from their own side, and they don't. And what's the ultimate nature of those conventional phenomena? Emptiness. Emptiness of existing inherently. What does inherently mean? From their own side. Or independently, that's a grosser word. I want to just briefly mention another famous line of reasoning, and this is actually Chandrakirti's own elaboration, and he uses the example of a chariot for this one. There's an earlier line of reasoning that from Nagarjuna that Chandrakirti bases on. That one is in Buddha Polidos, like that is the self. They present as, this is when if you were going to do the thing on the top of the cliff and they almost push you off and you have the sense of self, right? And then there, one way of reasoning is that self, right? The self that arises that seems to exist very solidly, usually right here, right? They say that one line of reasoning is that one with the aggregates. Right? The aggregates, what are the aggregates? The mind and the body, right? Aggregates are form, right? So the form, right, our body, feelings, discrimination, they call compositional factors, things like intentions and so on, or consciousness, right? They're the things that make up, form is what makes up your body, and the other four are things that make up, for the most part, your mind. Some of them are also neither mind nor, actually, yeah, some of them are neither mind nor body. Like, so for example, the I, right, sense of self, that's not body or mind, actually. It's just, it's another thing, but because it's not mind in the sense of an experience. What's the word? It's not mind in the sense that consciousness is mind. Consciousness is something that exists as an impermanent phenomenon in the moment, and that's more of a conceptual thing, right? There are concepts, for example, that are not concepts are the objects of mind, so they're not mind in that sense. But anyway, I'm getting at things like generic images, but that's a philosophical point. Anyway, one way of reasoning when you have that sense of I in your chest is, well, is that one with the aggregates, meaning my body and mind, or is it other? Is it something other than my body and mind? Chandrakirti elaborates on that. So he says, when you give rise to that feeling, I'll just read the list. He says, then you use 7 points of reasoning regarding the self. So the self is not one with the aggregates. The self is not something other than the aggregates. The self doesn't inherently depend upon the aggregates. It's not some basis upon which the aggregates inherently depend. It's not an owner of the aggregates. It's not the mere collection of the aggregates. And it's not the shape of the aggregates. I'm mentioning this one first of all because it's in this chapter and it's a very profound point. But also, those 7 points, Swami Siddhartha often uses those in teaching on emptiness. And one point he makes is why does Chandrakirti mention those, right? In part because those are the ways all of us in different moments sort of experience the self as if it existed in those ways, right? So like if you look in the mirror and you say, oh, I look good today, or I look terrible today, right? Like, you're having some sense that the I is the shape, right? Some form, some look, I look like that, right? Then at another moment you say, oh, my body's getting old. Right? Now suddenly the I is appearing like the owner, right? it's as if it's the owner of the aggregate. So one moment you're saying, I look good, right? There you're identified with the body, right? So it's the shape, right? And so then you have to be able to refute that one, right? Then other time you say, yeah, my body's getting older, you know. Well, now you're saying somehow you're like the owner of an aggregate, right? Then if you say, I feel sad today, well, now you're identifying with the mind, right? Somehow your I, you're not saying, you don't say the mind is sad today, right? You say I'm sad. So it's as if you're your mind, right? And so you analyze these different things, right? And anyway, I won't go into too much detail, right? But one point is, and again, conventionally, you get the point. Conventionally, if somebody says, "I'm sad today," you know, like the correct response is something like, you know, "Oh, sorry to hear that. You know, I'm here for you," something like that, right? You know, you don't do some alternate analysis. Well, are you your mind, or like that's it's mere convention. it's a mere. But you see how like those things exist in mere convention, meaning in mere name, right? And it's a verbal convention, right? And on that level, it's acceptable. But when you do an ultimate analysis, right, then you start to ask, okay, so if the self were one with the aggregates, well, the aggregates are many and the self is singular, right? So, like, and even, so like if you said, like, so then one reason they say is, so are there many selves? Like, is there a self that's the body and a self that's the mind? But then the mind has moments, so is there a self for each moment of the mind? And then there are different aspects to the mind, right? Like, you know, like, so your mind can be like sad while you're also driving and you're seeing the scenery, you know, so then there's a self that's sad and there's a self that's driving and there's a self that's has an arm and there's, you know, so it becomes ridiculous, right? That contradicts our experience. But then they say, well, so is the self other? Maybe the self's other than the aggregates. There are many philosophical, like non-Buddhist schools that say that, right? There's some kind of self that's something other than the aggregates. But then you have to say, so then like, when I say Jodi's here today, like, it's because she seems to be sitting there, right? Like, but is there something other than that that's like, maybe her body could not be here and she's still here because it could separate from the body and her mind, but it's not the mind separating from the body, it's something other than the body or the mind. Right? That becomes, whereas when we say self, right, we're referring to, you know, and if I say me, right, like I said, if I say, oh, they almost pushed me off the cliff, I was terrified, right? Well, I'm not referring to something other, it's like, it's my body that was almost pushed off the cliff, right? And when I say, you know, so you start to analyze your own experience and you analyze, well, is there some kind of self that's inherently other than, right, that has no connection to the body in that experience of being pushed, of being up the cliff or something, or somebody accuses you and you get upset, right? Somebody accuses you falsely of something. So then you check, well, who is the I that's upset? Well, it's my body and my, you know, like, well, they looked at me, my body, and then they said something which upset my mind. Is the self something other than those, right? So you analyze that. All the other five, if you disprove that the self is one with the aggregates or other than the aggregates, well then it can't, if it's not other than the aggregates, it can't be the owner of the aggregates, right? Because there has to be something other than the aggregates that could own the aggregates and so on. Anyway, so I'm not going to go into too much detail because Rinpoche will go into much more, but that's another core line of reasoning that Chandrakirti presents. And again, you get the point here, like, I just want to make this point, like it can seem, at one point if you start analyzing, like, I'm going to say it right, sometimes there's the danger, I think, of it seeming like you're just engaging in philosophical discussion for no practical reason. But that's not the case. I just want to emphasize that. These points are what you meditate on when you go meditate on emptiness. This is what when you actually, like, so for example, if you're feeling upset, right, like viscerally upset, right, and you were going to use emptiness as the way of dealing with it, you would identify the I that's upset, and then you would apply these 7 reasonings to go, does that I exist or not? Like, does it truly exist? Is that something that actually exists, that I that I'm experiencing, or is it something that's non-existent? Right? And you would use these 7 points in that case. So these are very practical instructions for practice in the context of meditation on emptiness. Okay, and the last topic I think we'll cover today, because I'm just going quickly, I said we do an overview, is a little bit of orientation to the mind-only school. because I think without that, it'll be very difficult to understand some of what, if people aren't somewhat oriented to that, then it's going to be quite difficult to understand what Chandrakirti's saying in some cases. Oh, let me bring that text over. And so I want to make a few points. One is, from the Madhyamaka, by the way, Prasangika, right, means, I just mentioned this, the word Prasangika I've been saying, Prasangika Madhyamaka, it's like a school of thought, right? And sometimes, I think Tashi will probably use this, the way that's translated into English is consequentialist. Prasangika, it would be translated into English as consequentialist. And the reason they do that is actually, that comes from that, what I was mentioning to Rajiv, the debate between Buddha, between Chandrakirti and Bhavaviveka. Bhavaviveka school are called autonomists in English, right? And the reason that they're called I'm going off on a slight tangent here, but they're called autonomous because Bhavaviveka used what he called autonomous reasoning. Whereas he would say, you have to present like a complete philosophical argument would have a premise, and proof of that premise and so on. Whereas Chandrakirti said, it's sufficient to merely show the reason why I call it consequentialist is, he would say, in order to realize emptiness, it's sufficient to point out the ludicrous consequences of a certain philosophical position. So somebody says, yes, the self truly exists in the aggregates, right? You don't have to present some kind of separate reasoning other than showing reasons why that's a ludicrous premise. And when the person sort of realizes that their own premise is ludicrous, that should be sufficient. You don't have to present some other reasoning. So they call him consequentialist because Chandrakirti, he does present sometimes other kinds of reasoning, but his main kind of reasoning is showing, what's the word? That's the word they use, absurd consequences to a certain position. And so Chandrakirti's main philosophical approach is to present absurd consequences. So that's why they call it consequentialist. Somebody had a...
So the definition of the word prasanga and ikai is basically followers would be, in Sanskrit it also means in discussion, like by words or by the way of discussion.
Oh, interesting.
Prasanga.
That's interesting. Well, he certainly is using words, yeah. But, okay, so then a few points about the mind-only school. One point I want to make is this, the middle way schools, and particularly the consequentialist or Prasangika's perspective, I want to say, first of all, I'd like to make it clear that it's not a disrespect. Sometimes it may seem like that because it's debating against positions of the mind-only school. But there's not actually a disrespect for the mind-only school. There's a great respect. Actually, it's considered, you'll see Lama Tsongkhapa if you read his writings. There's this perspective that the mind-only school is one of the two great traditions of the Mahayana, philosophical traditions of the Mahayana. And the view is that it was taught by the Buddha. And it was taught by a Sangha, who's considered to be a great bodhisattva, just like Nagarjuna was. So one point I want to make is that Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective is actually, and he wrote, if you read his what's it called, his text on differentiating the definitive and the interpretive meaning of the Buddha, you'll see he presents in humongous detail the teachings of the mind-only school, and clearly has great respect for that school. So one point is, it's not like to say that school's not a valid tradition. It is a valid tradition. But from the middle way school's perspective,
valid but incorrect.
But incorrect, yeah. The middle way school's perspective is this, essentially, is that when the Buddha taught the Prajnaparamita Sutras, right, which teach ultimately the view of the middle way and the view of that's espoused by Chandrakirti, for some bodhisattvas and for some practitioners, it's either too scary because it's so radical in its analysis of emptiness. That it's either too scary or too radical, or that the disciple who is not ready for that and would fall into nihilism if they tried to study it, that they would sort of become nihilistic. And so that essentially that the Buddha taught the mind-only school to suit such practitioners who would find Madhyamaka reasoning too radical and therefore too disturbing or too frightening, or sort of would and might either give up, or it might either become nihilistic, or might give up, or might give up their bodhicitta, thinking, well, that's too, and the most important thing, of course, is to continue practicing bodhicitta. So the Lama Tsongkhapa sort of describes it as, it's quite a useful, first of all, a very helpful position. And also, it brings one closer, it prepares one for somebody who doesn't immediately have the capacity for engaging in the kind of reasoning that Chandrakirti is doing. It's like a preparation. So the person can practice the mind-only school and progress on the path and create merit and sort of meditate.
It's seen as a necessary evolution.
What's that?
It's seen as a necessary evolution.
Not for everybody. They say for highly, the argument would be, the Gelugpa view at least would be, there are certain for highly intelligent disciples of great merit, they can directly engage with the teachings of Nagarjuna, for example, or Chandrakirti. But then there are other disciples from whom that's not suited to them at that time yet. They're not yet ready for that position or something. And for them it's better to first study the mind-only scriptures and practice those teachings, and later hear the Madhyamaka. That would be the kind of position that would be Lama Tsongkhapa's position. And but there is a kind of, if you look in the Gelugpa tradition, the way it's presented, which really is kind of Lama Tsongkhapa's, he also, in his writings, systematizes 4 different philosophical schools, from the Vaibhashikas, from the least subtle to the most subtle. And even within them, then there are subgroups. So he goes from the Vaibhashikas, which there are 18 sub-schools of, and then the Sautantrikas, and then the mind-only school, where there are followers of scripture, who are slightly less subtle, and then followers of reasoning, like Chandrakirti, who are slightly higher. Then the middle way, and he goes from the autonomous to finally the pinnacle of all, being the consequentialist, Chandrakirti. And you can see that Lama Tsongkhapa kind of says, actually, I'll just say from my own experience of reading those materials, I agree. It's my own experience, is that there's a humongous benefit in studying even the most gross of those different philosophical schools, because, and I say, I'll just say from my own experience. I remember, as an undergraduate, I read their teachings of Nagarjuna in school, and I didn't really think I understood them exactly, but I had some idea that I understood something about them. And then when I would read a lower school's position, I'd be like, oh, that's what I thought Nagarjuna was saying. I must have misunderstood Nagarjuna then. Let me understand what this philosophical school is saying. And by studying deeply what the philosophical school was saying, I was like, oh, so that's not at all what Nagarjuna is saying. And so it's only by sometimes studying those other schools that you can, because they're very subtle and profound, that you can then, when you study Nagarjuna, go, oh, okay, he's saying something much subtler than that, so what's he really saying? Does that make sense? And so it becomes a very useful. So it's in the Gelugpa tradition, there aren't really people who say the example of the Vaibhashika, the first of those schools. There aren't people who say, oh, my ultimate philosophical position is the Vaibhashika position. That's not, if you're a Gelugpa, you ultimately study the Prasangika perspective, right? But that it's very useful to study that in order to understand those higher philosophical schools. So that's one point also. But then, in terms of the mind-only school, there's this idea in the mind-only school called one philosophical position they have is that there's something called the alaya, or the basis of all consciousness. And Chandrakirti is going to address this, so I just want to mention it. So this idea of the basis of all consciousness, I want to explain why. I think it makes great sense why the mind-only school asserts that this exists. They would say, well, where? And I mean, the idea of karma, right? In other words, one of the most important things not to be a nihilist is to understand karma, right? And so one thing they would say is, well, how is, which actually, if you go to Dharma teachings long enough, you'll hear people, you probably most of you have heard this question asked, right? Well, how is karma carried from life to life? Right? People ask that, right? And how does that happen? And how can it ripen later? You know, and so on. And so the mind-only schools says, well, actually they were good philosophers, and they said, well, for something to carry karmic seeds, right, it can't, if it's like, they're both virtuous, neutral, and negative karmas, right? And so if you say, sometimes people would say, well, the mind carries them, right? But there's a problem with that, right? So a good philosopher would say, well, wait a second, like, so say I've created negative karma of murder, or something, right? But then I'm in a state of love, right? Well, how does a loving mind carry the seed of murder? Like, love is virtuous, and murder and hatred, say I murdered somebody, I have hatred. A hateful murder is negative. A mind of love is positive. So now they would say, so you're saying love somehow carries murderous hatred? That makes no sense at all. It's impossible, right? And so on. There are many like lines of reasoning there where they were saying that doesn't make sense, you know. And so, so people who asserted this idea of the basis of all consciousness said, well, there's a subtle basis of all consciousness that's neutral. That's the repository of karmic seeds. So that was one point they made. They would sort of say that's how karma is carried, and that's how it's carried from life to life. That's what goes from life to life. Yeah.
What's the Prasangika answer to that question? I've asked that question 100 times and haven't got what I consider to be a satisfactory answer to what is the nature of the karmic seed that is being carried from life to life.
The Prasangika perspective is that that's a highly useful, I don't think they use this word, but I don't think it contradicts the process, that's a highly useful fiction for people who would otherwise become nihilistic. And that it's useful for some people to believe that there's something, a mind is basis of all, subtle, neutral consciousness, that's the repository of all these seeds. And one day I was like thinking about it, I was like, yeah, I had this almost like mental image of like, I was like, well, is it like a truck where they're all held, or is it like a big field of space where there are all these seeds hanging out? You know, sometimes in science fiction you'll see these things like that, or like some kind of area of space where these little things, or something. You get a kind of mental image, like what is that? You know, and so the Prasangika perspective is that, and Chandrakirti says it actually in this text. He says, I mean, again, like they're not that there's a use, and he doesn't say this. Mamsakapa does. There's a use for that idea, but it's not ultimately true. Actually, there is no alaya. There is that the basis of all consciousness is not something that actually exists.
But without a lie, what is the Prasangika answer to that question?
I think
Chandrakirti gets into it in this chapter, and I don't know if we should, but I'll say very briefly. Chandrakirti, remember I said there are 8 difficult points? The Galukpa position is that there are 8 difficult points of the Prasangika school. And I didn't bring it. If you really want to actually study this, I have a recommendation. I mean, I'll say briefly, but I want to make a recommendation. If you really want to understand this one, first of all, you guys can Rinpoche about it, I'm sure he'll talk about it, but there's a book called, it's very thick, it's called The Unique Tenets of the Middle Way Consequence School. And it has a long section about this. And the section is called Disintegratedness.
Called what?
Disintegrated. And the book is called The Unique
Right.
Tenets of the Middle Way Consequence School. And the section of the book that I would recommend it's called, there's a whole a chapter or a series of chapters, I can't remember, called Disintegratedness. And there he gets into Chandrakirti's perspective on your question, Jeff. And what he says, and what Chandrakirti says, is this. And actually, Nagarjuna said, the Galukpa scholars go back and actually also quote Nagarjuna on this point. And this is very subtle, so it's hard. I mean, it's a very hard philosophical point, I think. But what they say is that, first of all, they say even the idea of a karmic seed, they would say it's just a metaphor, actually. Like, we're using that as a metaphor. A seed is a metaphor for something. It's not actually a seed. A seed is a physical object, right? And what they say is actually, this is subtle, like, they say actually that they're getting at impermanence actually, right? They say that, so first of all, like, all functioning things are, Buddha, one of the core tenets of Buddhism is all functioning things, or all things that arise due to causing conditions are impermanent from moment to moment, right? Now, everybody knows that Buddhism says that. And actually, it's a very subtle point, but so what does it mean to be a functioning thing, right? And one point they make, that Chandrakirti makes actually, is things that have ceased can still produce, things that have ceased can still be functioning things, basically. That's what he's getting at. And there's an example actually that Chandrakirti gives. He says, so you have a sad dream, right? He uses this example. He says, so a person has a disturbing dream, right? And they wake up and they recognize, oh, it was just a dream. But they still feel sad. We've all probably had experience, scared, right? Somebody had a nightmare. A child has a nightmare. And they wake up and you say, it was just a nightmare. It wasn't real. But the child's still scared, right? And he says, well, first of all, and Chandrakirti makes a couple points. He says, the events in the dream were merely appearances. They didn't truly, there was no truly existent monster, right? And it's over. The dream's finished. The person's awake, right? But it's still producing an effect. They're scared, right? And so Chandrakirti makes this point. He says, so things that have ceased can still produce effects. And also things that were not intrinsically real, like a monster in a dream, can still produce effects.
Because there's a new thing called a memory. Right? So the new thing is a result of that.
But he would say the memory is a
continuation
result.
of the old thing. It's a new thing.
Would it be helpful to think of it as momentum or not?
That's not what Chandrakirti's saying.
Well, if I push him,
Yeah.
I'm giving him momentum. Whether that continues on or not is another question. But I've started something, and that, just like the old balls at the click-clack, or in one electron at the other end, you've got electricity.
I think what you're saying is true. I agree with what you're saying. But I think Chandrakirti is getting at something even subtler than that.
Oh,
or
okay.
something. That's what I think is true. Because what Chandrakirti is saying is, and this is the term, most trends of Jeffrey Hopkins and others use this word disintegratedness. So what they're getting at is merely, like using the example of karma, right? Merely that an action was done, and it was impermanent, so it disintegrated, it stopped, it ended, right? There's any phenomena, including an action, stops. So it's mere having happened and then so disintegratedness. Well, actually, that word disintegratedness, which is
The
like a
effect
funny
hasn't
word.
happened yet,
Right.
right? So there's momentum.
I guess because the challenge with momentum, I think, is that momentum implies.
Well, there may be better words, but I mean,
Yeah.
something has to happen. The cause was there, and it's done its thing. So whatever it is that, is too subtle for my head, it's still in motion.
Means causality beyond the event. It's just causality, right? Something happens, right? There's a future event that is not happening at the same time. They are related. This has ceased, but the result is still to come.
Yeah, that's right.
So what's the mystery?
Maybe there's not. So that's what he's saying. The mere disintegratedness of an action is sufficient to give rise to a result. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that there doesn't need to be a seed, there doesn't need to be a neutral consciousness, there doesn't need to be a place where that seed is stored. There's the mere disintegratedness of the previous action is sufficient to give rise to a result without any other. Yeah, it's simple. Yeah, you got it.
Dr. Lawrence, but in this example, when you say dream, obviously the dream doesn't exist naturally, inherently, but then it's a mind moment. It's a mind moment during sleep. So I would take a stance where I would say, yeah, it's a mind at a subtle state, but it is a mind moment that produces cause and effect.
Right, but in this case, what he's saying is that it's an important point. Like, you know, we're getting a production of it, right? Like, you said it's a mind moment that's, say it right, that mind moment has to have ended in order to give rise to an effect, actually, isn't it?
But that happens otherwise too, even if you're not in dream. I want
Right.
to go murder somebody. I would have a mind moment where I plan for things, and then I go execute my action.
Yeah, and each one has to have disintegrated, has to have stopped in order for the result to occur, doesn't it?
Yeah.
By definition. Yeah, so that's all Chandrakirti is saying, that's sufficient. There's no need for something else. So there's no need for a mind as basis of all. There's no need for a storehouse of karmic seeds. There's no need for, that the mere having ceasedness of a previous action is sufficient to give rise to a resultant
So
effect.
at this point, we're bringing Paksha into it, the karmic latencies, probably from Galupa point of view. Would that be correct? A little more further down the road.
Yeah, the subtle thing is that some of the language we use in other contexts to talk about like karmic latencies, karmic seeds, and so on, while it's valid Buddhist language, is actually language taken from lower philosophical schools. It's just linguistically, right? And linguistically, the middle way school would say that's fine to talk that way, but it's not. But in reality, it's the mere disintegratedness of the previous action is enough. The mere fact that it exists, you know, that disintegratedness means it occurred, and it ceased.
So this would be true for even Bardo states, when moment before you die and the moment before next lifetime. And so a mind moment going from one birth to another birth.
Yeah, and the tricky part, I think, for some people, because we can actually see that very clearly, isn't it? In other words, like, you know, literally, like an external seed has to disintegrate. You can't say the seed still exists when the corn, like if you plant a corn plant, right, and then 6 months later you're, what's the word, harvesting corn, you know that the seed has disintegrated, right? You're not going to like look for the seed that you planted 6 months earlier, because that'd be silly, right? So we know that things by their nature disintegrate conventionally we would say that, right? There's the cause no longer exists when the result is manifest. The tricky part for some people that I think makes this subtle or makes this hard to understand is part of what Chandrakirti is saying though is like, so a person who murdered somebody 500 lifetimes ago, that action, the disintegratedness of that action can still bring about an effect of a lower rebirth.
Through what mechanism?
Through its mere disintegratedness.
That doesn't answer the question. That just replaces alaya with a non-conceptual state, right? Alaya describes a state, right? This simply says, well, there's no such state. It just happens.
But you're assuming that it has to happen.
It does.
In
Karma
the next
is
life.
definite.
Well, who knows?
Is time linear? Is it really 500 years?
Part of, I think, I'll just make one more comment, then we go on to a couple more very brief things, but part of what the difference, I think, part of the difference that Chandrakirti is getting at here, say it the right way, is that is actually, I'm say it the right way, that's accurate, but is that if we assert, I think it's something very profound actually in what he's saying. I'm not sure I fully understand it myself, to be honest, but I think part of what he's getting at is if we assert something more than that, we're grasping at a self. We're grasping at a phenomena that's truly existent. Yeah, that's what I think. So I think that's part. Well, it's clear. I think if you read the chapter, that's part of what Chandrakirti is saying. Is if you grasp at something more than that, then you're grasping at a truly existent or inherently existent person or phenomena, and then you've lost the middle way, Majjhamaka, right? The middle. They've lost the middle way, the Majjhamaka perspective. So that's but beyond that, I mean, that's a very difficult topic. But
besides, it's already mentioned, like, don't fret over how karma works. I mean, 10 things that Buddha said was one of them was that. I don't know why, but
it's beyond that. But I want to make one more quick point about this too. With one other point regarding the mind-only school and Chandrakirti's sort of analysis of it, just again for preparation because it'll come up, I think, is also so the mind-only school's perspective also. I don't know how deeply to go into this, but I'll just say, well, I'll start with a very brief part. Mind-only perspective is, from the mind-only school's perspective, part of, there are various meanings of emptiness in the mind-only school, but one of them is that, that external phenomena are empty of existing as a different entity from the mind apprehending them. So a cup is empty of existing as an entity independent of the mind perceiving the cup. And one of the implications of that, and this is debated from a Gelugpa perspective, one of the implications of that is that then that there are no external objects. That it's mind only, right? Like, they interpret, so at least Gelugpas interpret mind only as a kind of, what in Western philosophy we call idealism. A kind of idealism in the sense that a primacy of mind. Middle way school, again, it becomes very, I mean, on a gross, simplistic level, I would say, the Chandrakirti disagrees with that. Chandrakirti says, in this text, he disagrees with that position of the mind-only school, that there are no external objects. And he goes through a whole analysis of how, actually, and part of Chandrakirti's analysis of that, which is quite, if you read it, it's quite wonderful, really, is he's saying that the mind-only school gives a primacy to the existence of mind, actually. So they'll say, and they use these examples, like, so they'll say, for example, actually there's a beautiful passage in Chandrakirti, for example, where he says, the mind-only school will say, they'll use this example, they'll say, it's like in a dream. Like you dream of objects, and then when you wake up, you realize they seem like external objects, but they don't really exist. All objects are like that. And then Chandrakirti says, well, he says to the mind-only person saying that, he kind of has this debate in his text where he says, well, you're implying that the mind of the dream somehow was real. That the external objects were not real, but the mind perceiving them was. How is a mind that was perceiving unreal things have some kind of true reality? He says, I say, yes. I say neither. Neither was the mind also of the dream wasn't truly existent. So he's undercutting a kind of primacy of mind. And again, what he's getting, I think, is this, if you contemplate what he's getting at there, is that there's a grasping, right? There's a grasping at a self of mind, at a truly existent mind. And Chandrakirti, what he keeps doing is he gives absurd consequences again, right? And there are many absurd consequences to that, right? one is, you know, you could, I mean, you could go through a whole analysis, but a very simple one, right, would be, well, which moment of mind, like, mind is momentary, right? So which moment of mind is intrinsically real from its own side? Can you find that moment of mind? Is there some kind of moment of consciousness that's truly existent that you can somehow identify? And he's saying, you know, how does mind exist? It exists as something merely labeled, right, upon a collection of moments, right, with no intrinsic reality of its own. It's a mere conventional. You know, even consciousness is a mere convention, a merely conventionally existent thing, which is empty of existence from its own side. Anyway, so you'll see there will be a long section. I think I'm sure we'll get to it. Where, and so if you don't know that, if you're not aware that the mind-only school, part of its perspective is this idea of the mind is basis of all, which Chandrakirti then will debate with. But part of his position is this idea of a kind of, and again, according to the Gelugpa tradition, this idea that there are no external objects, and that consciousness has some kind of greater degree of reality than external objects. And Chandrakirti's position, which you'll see, is that, let's see if I say this right, is that, first of all, actually he would say, from a conventional perspective, actually Chandrakirti is very careful about conventional ultimate. He would say from a conventional perspective, external objects have the same reality status as consciousness. You know, so in other words, somebody could merely label and say, I feel sad today. They're labeling their mind. Somebody could say, I saw a red sign outside that said stop on it. And both are correct conventional assertions, and both are equally empty of intrinsic reality. And so, you know, your moment of consciousness and, you know, the building outside, you know, the building we're sitting in, both exist conventionally as mere dependent arisings, or you could say, or mere name, or as mere sort of appearances that are merely labeled by the mind and do exist conventionally as objects of discussion, but both are equally empty of inherent existence. Does that make sense? Kind of. So, and there'll be a section in the text on that. But if you didn't know that the mind-only school asserts that, then it would be confusing. Why is he saying that the lack of external objects is not a valid position? Well, he's sort of addressing a philosophical school that asserted that and saying that's not ultimately correct. Wow. Okay, well, we did a kind of orientation to this. And I want to go back, maybe the last thing I'll say is this, because I think, actually, I'll just make this comment. I think partly, you know, I made a comment, like almost a joke earlier, right, where I said, you know, that Kensho Rinpoche seemed quite happy. When I said, would you keep, I gave him, actually, we were in New York City, and I sort of suggested a few different topics with a kind of prime emphasis on Majambika, but I wasn't sure what Rinpoche would say. And actually, I knew that Rinpoche might like the idea of teaching generosity, patience, and ethics. And but I don't really know what Rinpoche thinks, of course. But I could imagine that Rinpoche might think, like, on the one hand, you know, these materials are difficult philosophically, right? Which is why you can see why now you can start to get the feeling, why did the monks at the great monasteries spend years debating and studying these topics in detail? You know, but also at the same time, right? So in one sense, I guess, you know, it could be difficult to understand, right? But then also, that's why I started, I think why Kensho Rinpoche starts with those quotes from the sutras, right? About the humongous benefits of studying emptiness, and that part of the point is, you know, if we want to achieve, say, the first bodhisattva bhumi, which we were talking about, where the generosity practice becomes surpassing, and where the person has realized emptiness directly, and so on, one has to study these teachings, right? In other words, like, you know, that's part of the point, isn't it? Nobody realizes, I mean, the Buddhist position is that people don't realize emptiness without studying the topic of emptiness. And that's why, like, you know, even the Buddha himself, right, when they say, well, actually, because everything is dependently arisen, right? When they say, well, how did the Buddha realize what he realized? They say, well, he studied with this Buddha and that Buddha, and in previous eons he studied with other Buddhas. And through that study, he eventually realized emptiness and became a Buddha and so on. And so, you know, even if as you're studying it, my suggestion is, even as we're studying with Khenpo Rinpoche, you know, some parts, you know, you'll see this sometimes, like I was looking back at my notes, and I realized like Rinpoche was getting into some difficult philosophical things, and then suddenly he would say, he would pause and he would say, remember, the essence is compassion. Practice bodhicitta. And he said, and study, and then gradually you'll make progress, and then, you know, and so on. And I think he was like recognizing people might get overwhelmed. And, but I guess the point being, one is, you know, if we go into the teachings with Khenpo Rinpoche, first of all, with the motivation of becoming a Buddha, you know, becoming enlightened for the welfare of others, that's the key point. And that then, you know, like I said, just studying these things and developing doubt tears samsara to shreds, right? So if you think about that and you start to have doubts, and you start to go, well, in what sense does the I exist? In what sense does the mind exist? In what sense do phenomena exist? And you start to question that and think deeply about it, and you continue listening and studying, that's the process, actually. There is no other, and I guess that's an important point, there is no other process, like to realizing emptiness anyway. It's not like it happens causelessly, right? Because nothing happens causelessly. And so what's the cause of realizing, of achieving the bhumis and so on, of progressing to Buddhahood and all that? Part of it's bodhicitta, right? But the other part is asking questions and thinking, and I'll conclude with this. I often, it's like an inaccurate quote, but it's a paraphrase. I often think of it though, like, I think it comes from Sakya Pandita, where there's this idea that, I rephrase it. It's not what he actually said, but I rephrase it. This is what I say to myself. If you want to be comfortable, forget about being wise. And if you want to be wise, forget about being comfortable. Which I love, that idea. You know, it's a paraphrase of his.
He was actually a mind-only proponent, though.
That's true.
And so we should, you know, I guess the idea is that, you know, by diving into this kind of material, we should be intentionally, I mean, actually, if you don't become uncomfortable at some point, you're not understanding, right? Like, if it doesn't make you somewhat uncomfortable at times to study Madhyamaka, then you're not really studying Madhyamaka, right? Like, because the idea of Madhyamaka, which Chandrakirti is doing, is actually ultimately, it's actually questioning the reality of, Khenpo Rinpoche says, actually, Khenpo Rinpoche makes a point. He says, everything you've ever experienced up to this point is tainted with self-grasping. You know, and he says, so like, and one day, I remember I was like very disturbed at Khenpo Rinpoche said, you've never yet had a moment of experiencing reality. I remember feeling very disturbed by that. Like, you've not yet had a single instant, you know, he was teaching in general, like in New York at the time, and he said, like, you've not yet had a single instant of experiencing reality. It's all been tainted with the appearance of inherent existence and then grasping at inherent existence. Everything you've ever done, everything you've ever thought, like every experience you've ever had, like from your birth all the way along. You know, and what this is trying to get at is to undermine that with wisdom, right? So that you experience reality, which is what you've never experienced. So if that's not a little bit uncomfortable, then we're not doing it right? Like, because we're questioning, you know, we're questioning the underpinnings of our sense of self. And remember, like up to now, you know, on behalf of that sense of self, we've lied, you know, we've cheated, we've like put in hundreds of hours, thousands of hours in building whatever, careers or relationships or like in the service of our sense of self, right? Like, and we've gotten angry at people and we've like found people, you know, we've grasped at some people and pushed other people away. We've done like everything we do in support of this sense of ourself as a kind of truly existent, independent phenomenon inside, you know, right here. And these teachings are to undermine that, right? In order to liberate us and grant us permanent bliss and compassion and joy on behalf of others. But so, anyway, I think it's not, you know, so it's like a brave, I guess, I think it's a very like, you know, to engage in the study of Madhyamaka thought is brave and is like a journey, you know, to something that we've never done, to someplace we've never been before. Right? That's not really a place, of course. So I just think it's very exciting, and hopefully we can, like, you know, to keep that in mind. And my suggestion is that, like, so that if some of the material is difficult, then our sense of that should be, oh, good, like now I'm really doing it. You know, like, and if you get to the point where you say, this doesn't make sense, this part I don't get, like, that's a good sign, right? Like, because if you already get it, then of course you're not. If you think, when you're at the phase of Khyentse Rinpoche is teaching Madhyamaka and you're going, oh, I know that part, I get that. Like, then you're not, then you're still comfortable, right? So you're not progressing in your journey to wisdom, or I'm not, or we're not. You know, so, like, hopefully it should be a little uncomfortable and a little challenging, and that's a good sign, I guess. And it should be like, and it's actually the most, isn't it? Like, from a Buddhist perspective, Lama Zopa, okay, I keep saying, I'll just leave this with where they go. Lama Zopa makes a point. He says, in samsara, you've already done all of that. Every samsaric thing you've done over and over again. But Lama Zopa says, the one thing you've never done is realize emptiness. Right? Like, that's one thing you've never done. But everything else you've done over and over again. So it's like a journey to the one thing you've never done. What Khyentse Rinpoche is taking us on a little bit, at least a part of the way to this. Okay. Let's do that. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not diminish, but increase. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends.